group there. Worked extensively with, I guess, a variety of science fields in the marine environment, including geology and geophysics, hydrography, freshwater fisheries, oceanography, fisheries, and biodiversity. And I guess we have, Jen sort of come up with the idea of sort of sharing this presentation with the branch off the back of your presentation that you did at the Surveying Spatial New Zealand conference, which was, as I understand, very well received. So thanks, Kevin, for joining us today. And I'll hand it over to you to run through your presentation.
All right, so thank you very much for the introduction. Just confirming, you should be able to see my title slide.
Yeah, I can do that.
Right, yeah, so as Nick said, this is a longer version of the presentation I gave at the surveying conference in Rotorua in August. And I'm going to fold in a bit more of the science as well as this, some new developments in the marine surveys that have happened since that talk. But this whole project test map, the NIWA Nippon Foundation Tonga Eruption Seabed Mapping Project test map, came about from a volcano in Tonga that originally started life as two separate islands, Honga Tonga, which is the island to the right in the foreground, and Honga Ha'apai is the island on the left. These are remnants of older cones of a much, much larger volcano. The volcano is actually about the size of Mount Ruapehu. It extends 2,500 meters above the sea floor, and these islands were just the very, very tips of some older cones that erupted several hundred years ago. So in 2015, a new event happened in this volcano that created a new island. It's the world's newest island between these two older islands, and eventually within a few years, this volcano had joined on to the two older islands to create one new island. And so that's why the island is called Honga Tonga, Honga Ha'apai with a hyphen, because it's effectively one island that joined the two older ones. So this volcano, as I said, it started in 2016. Over the next 5 years, it kind of grew and changed its shape a bit as it continued to erupt. It was actually very unusual. It's actually only the third volcanic island that's lasted above water for more than 3 months, basically in recorded history. Generally, these volcanoes that erupt, it's all ash and they're very easy to erode and they quickly be eroded underwater. This one persevered for many years and in itself was interesting. And actually on January the 14th this year, a paper came out indicating that it was inclined to survive for a very long time. How wrong that paper was. Because starting off in Christmas last year, 2021, the volcano started erupting quite violently, and between Christmas and January the 15th this year, these eruptions got increasingly more violent. Now, this is actually drone footage taken on January the 14th this year. It's the first question I get, is this actually a movie? It is. You just saw the lightning blast. And it's not in slow motion. This is real time. This drone was taken 5 kilometers away from the vent. It was being piloted by a boat, which is 5 kilometers away. And at the time, as volcanologists, in terms of their safety and shipboard operations, this was as close as shipboard operations would lay to get to an erupting volcano. As I will demonstrate later on, how little did we know about what these volcanoes can do and actually what the risks are to shipboard operations and surveys around these active volcanoes. You can quite clearly see you get some nice eruptions happening from the vent with some nice, what we call pyroclastic flows emanating out the side. That's those billowing clouds along the base of the volcano. And then you've got that very dense static-filled charged gas erupting into the atmosphere, which is causing all those lovely lightning bolts.
Holy shit!
So just 12 hours after that eruption, that photograph was taken, that video was taken, this happened. On Tonga, they experienced an incredibly large bang, followed immediately by a large tsunami that came right up, 15 meters high wash up. and it destroyed a lot of killed 3 people, destroyed a lot of buildings, destroyed the entire domestic fishing fleet, destroyed all the wharf facilities. Basically, something happened to that volcano from that video, which is where we thought it was safe to approach, and this was as bad as it was going to get. Within 12 hours, something happened that caused that loud bang and this massive tsunami. In actual fact, we know from the science that the tsunamis were much more complicated than we thought, and the tsunamis actually were happening before the volcano erupted, and tsunamis continued to happen after the volcano erupted. So there's some really weird stuff going on about what's happening on the sea floor that's not necessarily related to the Big Bang, but it can still generate these tsunamis. And here's a satellite image taken from space. Now, I want you to watch not so much the cloud, but when you watch it again, watch the blast wave that emanates immediately before that. That blast wave is the sound wave, and it was so violent and so loud that it was heard audibly in Alaska. Now, I know I've got people in New Zealand that quite clearly heard it. They thought it was thunder over the horizon. It was actually that blast wave from the volcano, and it's the loudest and largest ever blast wave recorded by modern instrumentation from a volcano. And that cloud, that ash cloud you see, actually rose up to over 58 kilometers high. Now that's beyond stratospheric. That's into the mesosphere. That's insanely huge amount of altitude that cloud went, and it's the highest ever and the largest ever plume ever recorded by modern instrumentation. So, just based on what we know from the satellites and from the people on the ground in Tonga, we knew straight away that this is one of the largest events, volcanic eruptions, certainly in the last 50 years, and probably the largest since Krakatoa in 1883. And here's, I love this shot. This is a shot from, again, from NASA, just showing it with the curvature of the Earth, showing that plume. But on the panel on the right, we can actually see the sort of sequence of what happened to the volcano. Starting off at the top one, we have an image from January the 7th this year, where you can quite clearly see the island. But by January the 15th, those violent eruptions that we saw in the video earlier had actually removed the island and exposed the crater to seawater. So it made it an underwater volcano, and that's a critical step that can explain why this eruption was so violent. And then the last panel on the bottom, which is January the 18th, this is after the eruption, and we can quite clearly see that those 2 islands, while they still exist, have been dramatically reduced in size. So it really literally blew itself to bits, that volcano, from this massive explosion. And the effects to Tonga itself can't be really underestimated. There was 3 deaths. I think the death toll is now 4. I think there's a subsequent death that's being attributed to it. 80% of the population have been impacted by the eruption and tsunami. All the communication cables were cut. That's the cables that were international, that given to the access to the outside world, but also the domestic cables to the outer islands were all cut instantaneously by the eruption. Crops, livestock, freshwater supplies, fisheries all badly affected, and it's basically nearly 20% of the GDP worth of damage, which is a lot to pay for such a small country and such a small economy. So if we look at the first responses we had in terms of seabed and trying to understand what needs to be surveyed immediately after the water, we had this map here that was given to us from the Tongan Cable Company and the Tongan government. And what this map shows us in the white lines are the 2 communication cables. The line that goes east-west is international cable, goes to Fiji. That connects Tonga with the outside world. And that white line that goes north-south, that's the domestic cable that connects Tongatapu, the main island, with the rest of the outlying islands. And those yellow crosses there are where the cable breaks happen. So when they immediately afterwards, they put a cable ship out, and they try to find the cable to try and see if they can repair it. And those crosses indicate where they found ends of the cables. Everything in between those crosses, the cables just disappeared. So given that limit, we've put the black dashed line, which is about 55-kilometre radius. We know for a fact that the seafloor has been affected at least by that radius because of the eruption. So certainly all the previous mappings that have been had up to that date, we know are basically out of date. but also clearly any evidence that lets us to really understand why that volcano erupted so violently is also somewhere within that kilometre. So given this radius, NIWA with their vessels, the Tongariro, combined with the Nippon Foundation, which is Japan's largest private philanthropic organisation, they provided the money. We came up with a project to really try and understand the effect this eruption had, not just on the seafloor through surveying, but also in terms of the oceans and the life within the oceans. Now, actually, I'll go back a slide. There's a couple of other circles you should note. There's an orange circle and a red circle, and that they were safety barriers when we were operating a manned vessel so close to an active volcano. We were really conscious about where we didn't want to go, and so those barriers were basically a zone where we decided it was not safe to operate the Tongariro. And the reason why it's not safe is even if the volcano doesn't erupt violently like we saw before, all volcanic eruptions are driven by gas. And if you inject gas into water, it lowers the density. And basically, steel boats don't float in gas. So you only need a really, really minor eruption, like a really insignificant eruption under the boat, and you could potentially lose the boat instantaneously with all hands without even a chance to send out an SOS. So something that really kept in the back of our minds when we operated the Tongariro so close to this active volcano. And this video is going to show an experiment that was done. Actually, it was done about generating tsunamis, but it's quite relevant. This is a tank of water, and when I push the animation, we're going to inject a small bubble of gas into the bottom of the tank, and you can just watch and see how those bubbles expand, and then what happens onto the surface of the water when that bubbles comes through. So quite clearly, you don't need much gas on the seafloor to create a safety shipping hazard around it. So that's why the Tongariro chose not to approach inside the caldera itself or too close to the summit. And there is background to this. 1952, the Japanese lost one of their research vessels that went to investigate an underwater eruption. And basically, it happened to be coincidentally in bad luck, sailed right over the top of the vent when it erupted, and they lost it with all hands. So these things have happened in the past, and it's certainly mindful that when we're doing any sort of surveying of active volcanoes, about what sort of risks there are to the vessel and to the people on board. So the first response for this testmap project was a 28-day voyage by the Tongariro. Its primary mission was initially to multi-beam map that area within the black dash radius to really find out what happened on the seafloor and see if there's any evidence of the eruption on the seafloor. But as a follow-up to that, the Tongariro also conducted other scientific operations, including underwater cameras. That unit going over the side there is called a CTD, a conductivity and depth probe, which contains water bottles as well. And those water bottles can be triggered at certain depths to capture the water at those depths that they can be analysed in the lab. We also deployed that unit there is called a multi-corer, which lands on the seafloor and presses down those tubes to retrieve sediment samples, which we're hoping can tell us about the nature of the volcanic material that was erupted onto the seafloor. We also deployed gliders. Again, we didn't want the Tongariro to go over the crater, but we used these autonomous vessels and deployed them over the crater, and they carried out oceanographic instrumentation and measurements over the crater where the Tongariro felt it was unwilling to go to. And this is the results of the survey, the multi-beam survey that we did. This is the area that we mapped. We mapped in total 22,000 square kilometres of seafloor, of which 14,000 square kilometres had never been mapped before. So not only were we remapping areas that had been mapped, we actually did acquire a lot of data where there had been no previous multi-beam data before. And that shows the area coverage. Hongatonga, Hongaapai is up in the top right. You can see the little donut hole we didn't get into, but we also targeted other seamounts nearby as well for a variety of reasons. because one of them which is because these active seamounts are still active volcanoes and they still pose a risk to Tonga, but also because these seamounts could give us an indication about what the underwater should have looked like before the eruption. Now let's zoom into the area around the volcano, Honga Tonga Hanga'apai itself. Oh, so just for the reference, that's the international cable. So we can see we did some multi-beam mapping over the international cable, over the cable breaks, to try and understand what first of all, why the cable broke, but more importantly for the cable company, they wanted to try and retrieve that segment. So we did some surveys over there for the international cable, and we did surveys over the domestic cable as well. Again, really to assess why the cable broke and is it possible to retrieve that cable. When we look at the volcano itself, as I say, it's a huge volcano. It's the size of Mount Ruapehu in total. The volcano itself was surprisingly intact. One of the working theories we had as scientists to explain the violence was that somehow or other the volcano had collapsed. A part of the side had come away, and that would have exposed the magma chamber to the seawater, and which could have caused a volcano. But the initial mapping from the Tongaroa's multi-beam showed that actually the volcano itself is intact. And actually not only intact, it's actually really, really hard to see any evidence of any violence on the seafloor whatsoever. You also note, again, you can see the hole in the middle that the Tongaroa chose not to go to. But having said there's no violence, we can see some ripples and sediment waves coming down the side, which indicate things called pyroclastic density flows have occurred down the sides. And then further out to the northwest, we can see large sediment waves indicating that those flows probably extended all the way out into the deep water, into 3,000 metre plus water in the lower basin. And just in terms of scale there, you're talking about 30, 40 kilometres away. So these potentially we got evidence that these pyroclastic flows caused by the eruption have extended many tens of kilometres from the summit itself. And in terms of pyroclastic flows, here's a nice video I found. This is a volcano in Indonesia that's erupted. It's a very small eruption, but you can see it's triggered one of these pyroclastic flows that come through. So what they are in layman's terms, they're avalanches. It's an avalanche full of super hot rock, ash, steam, and that ash and steam basically creates a frictionless surface between the ground surface and the flowing debris. So this avalanche just accelerates, it goes down the slope. And once it enters the sea, like it does here, that super hot rock then instantly turns the seawater into steam, and it creates a little envelope of steam that surrounds the avalanche and allows these avalanches to flow for a very long distance underwater. So that's when we talk about pyroclastic flows, that's a classic pyroclastic flow. And when we look at, when we truly analyse the mapping that the Tongaroa did and actually compared it to the mapping before, and we create this is called a difference map, a lost game map, we can actually clearly see there's actually a lot of changes to the seafloor, a lot of evidence of these pyroclastic flows happening. The areas in blue are places where the seafloor has been eroded away by these massive pyroclastic flow avalanches. And in places that these avalanches have taken away 100 metres of depth or 100 metres of elevation away from the old seafloor. So they really have scoured deep channels into the sides of the volcanoes. And then the areas in the red is where new material is being added. And you can see in some places where it gets really dark, I mean, in places it's added up to 45 metres of extra material that's being dumped onto the sea floor. And this difference map that we have, that we've got from the multi-beam mapping, allows us to answer the simple question about what happened to those, certainly what happened to the domestic cable. Quite simply, domestic cable was buried under 30 metres of material. It's just completely buried. And when we told this to the cable company, they're not going to retrieve it. They're just going to have to lay a new cable. There's no way they're going to try and drag through 30 metres worth of material just to retrieve an optic fibre cable. So I'm going to show this. I'm going to show an animation now. So part of the process that we did when planning the survey and trying to guess what happened is we knew pyroclastic flows, or we suspected pyroclastic flows had flowed underwater. And so we ran some modeling with some of our tsunami modelers and our avalanche modelers about what happens if you release a pyroclastic flow, a very large pyroclastic flow from the volcano, and let the model calculate where this material flowed underwater. So in context, this is the sort of scale we're talking about. We're talking about to this map again, looking at about 40, 50 kilometers worth of XY units of the map. And I'm going to run this animation, and you can see what happens, what the modeling says about these, how far these pyroclastic flows can go. I do have to apologize for the map. It's not designed really for public consumption. It's just really a modeling process. But for context, the red dot is Tonga Volcano. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but Tongatapu Island is down here. And the international cable runs down, if you look at these bathymetric contours, runs down this corridor down here. So when I run this animation, you see just have a look, keep an eye on this corridor down here, this valley, and see what happens to these pyroclastic flows when it runs through this valley. So this model actually shows us that it is possible for pyroclastic flows to get into that valley for the international cable. And that's significant because there is actually a topographic high rising from Tongatapu east-west that in theory should stop any flow from getting there. But these pyroclastic flows, or this modeling has showed that this eruption was so large that these flows actually flowed uphill and went up over the top of this topographic high and into the next valley, and then flowed through, wiping out the international cable. So that's certainly what the modeling suggested. And when we look at what the multi-beam data showed, this is a backscatter of the international cable. For context, it's that red bounding box that I've got in the locality diagram on the top right. So it's quite a large area. We can see from the backscatter, there's a volcano immediately to the north, an active volcano. You can see through the backscatter, you can see radiating flows from those lava flows from that volcano. And there's another volcano immediately to the south. But you can actually see through the backscatter, you can actually trace where the flow actually went on January the 15th. And the flow kind of did this sort of direction. It kind of did a sinusoidal flow down the valley, up one side of the volcano, swung back north to the other side, and then flowed out. And you can actually see some mega ripples in the backscatter indicating there's definitely some flow happening on the seafloor. And that yellow star is where the international end of the cable was actually found. So the brown line is where they laid it, but that yellow star is where the broken bit was found, and it was found several kilometers to the north. And at first, no one could explain why it was found several kilometers to the north, but this pyroclastic flow modeling and this backscatter diagram quite clearly shows what happened to the international cable. It literally got ripped to bits and was sloshed up north as the flow meandered its way along this valley floor. So in terms of the seabed mapping, we got some kilometers there. Basically, the edifice is still intact. We saw many pyroclastic flows, and we've mapped them for at least 50 kilometers from the volcano. In terms of that difference loss diagram, the amount of material we just saw in that red and blue difference loss diagram was quite staggering. So we saw in the red at least 7 cubic kilometers of material, a seafloor added, of which we had explained 3 cubic kilometers of stuff being removed from the blue, from the flanks, but there's at least 4 cubic kilometers of material that's being added to the seafloor that we can't explain. And put things into context, the Mount Vesuvius eruption that destroyed Pompeii was 0.8 of a cubic kilometer. And that's 7 cubic kilometers of material. That's 15 Wellington harbours worth of material that's being added. It's an incredibly large volume, and these sort of numbers put it certainly in in terms of one of the largest volcanic eruptions certainly since Krakatoa. And we know for a fact that these flows, there's actually more. These numbers are going to be wrong. They're definitely an underestimate because we haven't mapped, or we didn't map then at the Tongariro their summit, and we didn't map further out offshore. So we suspect that these numbers have got to dramatically change once we've fully analysed all the mapping data we've got. One of the other things we did, and one of the other questions we had to answer is, okay, given that all this eruption happened on the seafloor and it's affected the seafloor, it's buried the seafloor under certainly up to 30 meters or 40 meters of material. What's it looking like for life? What does the seafloor look like now? What are the implications for things that used to live there, like commercial fisheries or coral reefs or invertebrates and things? So we did a high resolution camera survey. This is a towed camera that basically took videos and stills. And from those towed cameras, we could count the amount of things that were still living on the seafloor. And this map kind of gives us an indication about where we saw things living versus where we didn't see anything living at all. So ignore the writing. Basically, the more colors you see, the more rich life is. And when you see an X, that means that we dropped the camera down and we didn't see anything living at all. And unsurprisingly, close to the volcano, we saw no evidence of any life living at all. But on the surrounding seamounts, we actually saw a lot of species richness. And this kind of tells us that these seamounts are high enough to be away from those pyroclastic flows, but also that these seamounts also can provide breeding stock, as it were, or a source of new material to repopulate Honga Tonga Hanga'apai in the future when life starts to recover from it. That box shows around the volcano itself. Now, interesting enough, there is still life living on the volcano. I mean, I showed you that map that showed many cubic kilometers of seafloor had been added or taken away, and yet there are still little patches of shelter tucked behind lee sides where life, not very healthy, but it's still living on the sides. So that was a big surprise for us, that actually life is hanging on there. But again, you look at it's only just one or two species groups. It's not very bio-rich. And these other sites here, these indications where even a long distance away, life has been extinguished, and that tells us that these pyroclastic flows, you know, we've mapped them with the multi-beam to go at least 50 kilometers away, but in actual fact, the fact that we're seeing very little life all the way out these sort of distances up to 80, nearly 100 kilometers away, means that these pyroclastic flows must have gone a long way, and that's sort of what the modeling was indicating to us in the first place. And I'm going to show some video now, underwater video. So this video was taken very, very close to the summit. So these are two sites very close to the summit. So it's right near the very edge of the crater. Zero life whatsoever on there. It's just muddy ripples, and you have a look at those bedrocks. That's very sharp and angular. It's really being ripped to bits, showing a lot of violence. If this was a healthy seafloor, especially in the tropics, you expect to see corals and crabs and all sorts of interesting life hanging on, but this is just being ripped to bits. Now this video here, this is a different site. This is actually a video where on the difference map was in the dark blue. This is a place that we know had been completely eroded away by these pyroclastic flows. Unlike the previous shot, all we're seeing here is fine sediment. We're not seeing any of the sharp bedrock or any of those big bouldery avalanches that you expect to see. It's just completely covered by fine sediment. And there's just a contrast between a pyroclastic flow on the right versus just part of the crater, part of the volcano edifice on the left. Now, in contrast, we're going to look at a couple of sites. These are actually both active volcanoes in their own rights, but they actually have a lot of species richness, just as a compare and contrast between what we saw in Honga Tonga itself versus what we should have seen. So this is a volcano immediately south called Volcano 3. Brilliant name, totally imaginative. Thanks, scientists. And Volcano 3 erupted last in 2007. So this life that we're seeing, some whip corals and sponges and some crabs on there as well, some anemones, all this life has grown since 2007. And we also found very large schools of snapper on there as well. So it is actually what we call, this is what we expected to see in Honga Tonga before the eruption. But it's also really nice to see that this volcano, which is only 20 kilometers away from, don't forget, this is the largest ever eruption recorded, certainly in the last 50, 60 years. life is basically looks completely unaffected. What you're not seeing in any of those images is ash. There's no fresh ash on there whatsoever. 20 kilometers away, the ash we saw landing on Tonga Tapu, we're not seeing any evidence of that in here. In fact, there's no evidence of a volcanic eruption on this volcano at all, even though it's only 20 kilometers away. And we don't know why. And in contrast, this is a volcano further south. This volcano is called Volcano 2. And this is the only part of the seafloor that have been actively mapped and analysed before this eruption. It actually has an active hydrothermal vent system. So these mussels are actually living in about 400 degrees centigrade water from an active hydrothermal vent. And these are very, these mussels need very, very specific situation to survive. And if there was any change in the water mass or any change of sediment flow coming from the airborne ash, these mussels would be quite unhealthy. But in actual fact, we analysed these, put cameras through them exactly like the first scientists did 10 years ago, and they're perfectly healthy. They're in exactly the same spot we were before, completely unaffected by an eruption, even though we know other parts have been completely wiped out. And another part of life that gets overlooked is actually what the life that actually lives inside the mud. Now, we call this myofauna. This is actually things that actually live inside the mud, and they've got a couple of good images there on the right of these little critters that actually live inside there. So we know from the camera work that a lot of the seafloor is desert, and it's being overrun by these pyroclastic flow materials. What has actually happened to the life that actually lives inside these muddy sediments? So these are the sites where we took these cores. And here's an example of this site here, which is it's about 80 kilometers away as the crow flies from the volcano. That bottom arrow there indicates where the old seafloor was. And we can see the tube is completely filled with completely new material. So 80 kilometers away, we're getting over a meter of new material that's being added to the seafloor. So any life that was existing has just been completely buried, absolutely buried. As opposed to this site now, which is a site very, very close to Tonga Tapu. It's much closer to the volcano. It's only about 25 kilometers from the volcano. Instead of that muddy gloop that we're getting from the distal things, we're actually finding very, very coarse material. Again, it's still pyroclastic flow material, but it's actually incredibly dense. It's best way to describe it is a non-Newtonian fluid. The harder you press, the harder it got. It was very hard to work with, and that really has implications for life trying to recolonize this. If it's so hard to drill into for living and for making burrows or to feeding off, it's going to be very difficult for life to recover in this area. And that black area too, that's also the stuff that buried the domestic cable too. So again, if they're dredging or if they're trenching the cable, it's going to be very hard to trench, if not impossible. But I think when we talk to Tongan cables, I think they're just talking about no trenching, just relaying new cables on top of the old seafloor. So some key messages about in terms of the life. As expected, most of the life was wiped out around the volcano, and most of the life was wiped out in the deep channels, which we expect from the pyroclastic flows. However, there was still plenty of abundant life and fish communities on those nearby seamounts. And in fact, they appeared to be completely unaffected by the volcano, which is quite surprising. And the last sort of area of science we looked at with the survey was about the effects of the water. What happened to the water when you put all the volcanic material into it? And we can quite clearly see from this particular eruption, this has taken a few months before the Big Bang, but if you have a look at the water, it's completely discolored. And basically, if you put ash, and ash contains a lot of heavy metals and trace elements, at certain levels, these trace elements can be a nutrient and actually can stimulate life production. But in other times, if you put too much of these trace metals and heavy metals into the water, it can actually be toxic. And we know straight after the eruption, here's a couple of slides of chlorophyll A. This is basically phytoplankton. On the left, we have 2 weeks before the eruption, we can have the phytoplankton eruption. Phytoplankton layer is seen by satellite. There's a few hotspots around the islands itself. But immediately afterwards, we can see a massive plankton bloom, and that tells us that a lot of these chemicals and metals have entered the seafloor through this volcanic eruption and has created a massive plankton bloom. So we know that it has severely changed the water chemistry around Tonga itself. And so this is the CTD again with the water bottles. So what we really wanted to understand is if you have a volcanic ash and all this eruption, we needed to take samples at different water depths to really understand what's happened to the chemistry to this water and how it's changed because of this ash. Now, I think this video, let's just see if this video plays out as to what I'm thinking of. Here we go. So we're now into the dark zone. You can quite clearly see it's still clear water. We're below the light zone coming through. But as we went deeper, we entered this layer about 200 meters deep that best gets surmised as a fog, like a pea soup. Some places have got pea soup. You couldn't even see the CTD from the GoPro that's hanging on the cable. Whatever was in the water column was so dense at 200 meters, you couldn't actually see it. Once you get below that 250 meters, it goes back to clear again. So we know from the GoPro, we knew from the CTD that there's quite clearly around the volcano a dense layer of something that's sitting in the water at about 200 meters. And when you look at that something, when we picked it up and looked it under the microscope, what we're actually seeing is shards of glass. So that something actually is ash, volcanic ash. Now, the problem with that is at 200 meters deep, we know that's not the ash from the eruption because that ash from the eruption should be much deeper than 200 meters deep. So there must be another source of this volcanic ash in the water that's generating this layer at 200 meters deep. And when we looked at the CTD, this is the instrumentation that we put in. We're looking at beam transmission. This is effectively backscatter, basically acoustic backscatter by depth. So in the yellow is where there's a lot of backscatter. That indicates there's something at that 200 meter depth that's actually reflecting a lot of acoustic energy in the water column as the CTD goes down to the surface. And on this map too, because it's latitude on the x-axis, so close to Hongatapu summit itself, that's where the layer is densest. And as we progress away from the volcano, whatever this glass is actually decreasing in density as we move away. And if we plot this ash layer where we see it on a map, and these brown dots indicate where we did see this ash layer, so it's not all the sampling, but you can actually see that this ash layer is thickest around to the northeast of the volcano, especially very close to the summit, with some minor occurrences as we move further away. Again, indicating this tells us that whatever the source of this ash is, and remember, this is not ash from the January 15th eruption because that's too shallow for that. It's something else is generating ash or glass, and we know from this that it's actually coming from the surface. From the volcano summit itself. And the implications of ongoing this, again, remember I said volcanic ash contains a lot of metals and trace elements, and those metals and trace elements, if they're in too high concentration, can be toxic for life. So the fact that there's still this material being erupted into the ocean really has implications about, especially for commercial fisheries and the ability for the sea life to recover in any state. So we've taken a lot of water samples and running a lot of experiments on the water to really try and understand what these implications are for this ash layer. And that brings us on to the second part of this test map project. So I've gone on and on about the Tongariro and all the work they did, but you have noticed that there was the Tongariro didn't get into the summit of the volcano for very clear health and safety reasons. We didn't want a crewed vessel to go in there. So part 2 of this test map project involved an uncrewed surface vessel. This is the USV Max Lima. It comes from a company called Seakit, which is based in Essex in the UK. It has an EM710 multi-beam echo sounder on it, but it also has the ability to deploy lots of different instrumentations down the cage, out the stern, a lot of other scientific instrumentation. So plan part B of this was where the Tonga didn't get to, we're going to let an uncrewed surface vessel fill in that gap. It started its operations in July. When I reported to the surveying conference in August, it was kind of underway, but it's now finished its operations. And here's it at sea, some nice video of it swanning around in the Pacific. In the background to the right of the video, you can see the two islands of Honga Tonga, Honga Apai. And on the left, that's just a little screenshot from my cell phone. So it's uncrewed. It has communications all done through high bandwidth satellites. And I can actually sit on my cell phone and actually get real-time feeds of where the boat is and actually look at the various instrumentations real-time and actually track where it was as well. So it's actually really neat to actually play with this sort of new technology that lets us remotely operate these remotely operate these surveys in a safe way. And in terms of the surveying on board, a couple of screenshots on the left, we have what they call the remote operating center, the ROC. So these are the ship's captains. They're sitting in Essex, and you can see their display. So they real-time control the vessel in terms of they've got the radar displays and the cameras. They control the vessels with inputs via the satellite. And on the right, in terms of the multi-beam operators and the surveyors, we still get exactly the same screens that we would if we're on board a boat, but the difference is that we all send them from the comfort of our own home or our own office. So in terms, we had 24-hour operations. We had 4 shifts of surveyors on board, and the surveyors were from all over the world. We had surveyors from Ireland, Egypt, Poland, Australia, New Zealand, and the US, all taking turns about operating the multi-beam. And unlike an autonomous vessel, there's direct comms between the operators and the boat drivers. So if we wanted to, if like we lost bottom lock or we wanted the boat to explore something, we could just tell the operators to, hold fire or turn the port a bit more. We still have the direct communications if we're all on board the vessel. The difference is that we're doing it from different parts of the globe. And this is something that I presented in August. The first initial results have come through from the first missions. Certainly in August, they come through where they're mapping that gap. The first thing that we noticed was there's a giant hole on the top of the volcano, and I can't stress how giant this hole is. It's 850 meters deep. So don't forget, when I started this presentation on the original slide, there was an active volcano that bridged those two islands, and that volcano rose to 100 meters high above sea level. So we've gone within 12 hours from a volcano that was 120 meters above sea level to now a hole that's 850 meters deep instantaneously. So there's your evidence of violence, and that hole is where all this extra material came from. It's truly a dramatic hole. But what's really neat that we just discovered, and on the right we can see a screenshot of the mid-water display from the acoustics. We can quite clearly see active plumes of material erupting right now from inside the crater. And these plumes, this is the source of this glass that we saw in the Tonga. This tells us that actually the volcano is still erupting. In fact, not only is it still erupting, we can actually see with the multi-beam data, there's actually a new cone being formed right now. So potentially, within 10 years, this could be a new island coming up. So yes, the volcano erupted in January, but it's still erupting right now. And this is the final picture. This has only just been finished. The sea kit, USV, and the Tonga have all done their jobs. We've got the data. This is now the complete multi-beam map of the sea floor. So the hole, again, I can't stress how big it is. Don't forget, this is a mountain the size of Mount Ruapehu. It's now got a massive hole, 850 meters deep, inside it, where it was 100 meters high before. And I've been really struggling to get a concept about how big this hole is. So what I did, I gave this presentation to Auckland University, and I decided to try and put it in context of Rangitoto Island, which is something that most people kind of know how big it is. Rangitoto Island, in terms of its area, is exactly the same size and dimensions in terms of its length and breadth as the whole. The difference is the height, right? So Rangitoto Island's about 200 meters high, just over 200 meters high. So if I turned that hole and converted it into a mountain and placed that mountain where Rangitoto is, and this is really crude, so I apologize, but effectively that is what it would look like. So if we turned Rangitoto into the hole and expanded its size to make it fit, and then put it back in the Auckland skyline, that's how big it is. And don't forget, this is the hole in the ground that was blown up by that eruption. The volcano itself is much, much bigger. So that's basically the end of my talk. All the surveying is done. Having said that, there's some planned return surveys. Next one will be 2024. We're going back out there again, and we'll be using an uncrewed surface vessel again to sort of do a follow-up to find out what's happening on that volcano and see what changes is happening in terms of, is life recovering, or is the active volcano still affecting the sea floor? And that's kind of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Kevin. And I'm sure if we're all in a room, we'll be giving a big round of applause right now. So yeah, it was really fascinating to hear, I guess, the work you completed and the staggering sort of numbers which demonstrate the scale of the explosion and the destruction in its wake. Really interesting to get an insight into the safety considerations you guys had to think about as well. And also the sort of equipment you use, including the remote operations, which I guess is becoming more commonplace across the wider surveying industry. I guess, yeah, also with the international team you had on board, really took remote working to the whole new level, I suppose. So yeah, I think yeah, all of us here would have taken something relevant from your presentation today, especially just the mind-numbing scale, I suppose, of what happened there, and I guess its international significance. So yeah, thanks very much for your presentation. And I guess just quickly, we sort of are running a little bit short of time, but does anyone have any questions they want to jump in quickly?
Yeah, Nick.
Yep.
Kevin, fabulous presentation. Thank you very much. Who funds these sorts of studies that you're doing? Is it the international community? Is NIWA with its standard funding? And what can Tonga draw from this to aid their recovery?
Yeah, so a couple of great questions there. So in terms of the funding, NIWA funded quite a bit, but we couldn't have done this without the Nippon Foundation, which again, as I said, that's Japan's largest private philanthropic organisation, and their connection to seabed mapping is, first of all, Nippon Foundation funds the Seabed 2030 project, so they're already heavily invested in marine surveys anyway. But also the family that owns Nippon Foundation are personal friends with the King of Tonga. So their families have known each other for 80 years. So there's always been this connection between the Nippon Foundation and Tonga. So funding itself was pretty easy to find for this survey to come up with. And we know from these results that we think that the funding will be there. We've got a lot more international connections now through other agencies that want to contribute for the upcoming surveys. So we think funding is going to be secure certainly for the next survey that's coming up, 2024. In terms of the effects on Tonga, so the implication, there's a couple of implications for Tonga that they really need to know. First of all, the tsunami warning system failed for them. There was no warning. The buoys didn't work. And the question is, why didn't the tsunami buoys work? Well, the tsunami buoys didn't work. We know this in hindsight is because these waves weren't a wave like you see on crashing down the beach that the surfers run on. These waves behaved in a completely different way that the tsunami alert system buoys weren't actually geared to monitor. So again, the implications, and this is a global implication about, maybe the new version of dart buoys that are going out or whatever are going to have to look at other ways to actually track these tsunamis, because the traditional tsunami wave didn't apply, or the tsunami model didn't apply in this result. The other implication for Tonga is certainly then you have to think about, we know that this volcano erupted this way. Our mapping showed at least 3 more volcanoes within 50 kilometres of Tongatapu that are also very active. This could happen again to any one of the volcanoes. So what implications for Tongan's infrastructure? Do they need to think about making more robust port facilities? Do they need to think about maybe hardening their fresh water supply so they're not so prone to having F4 ash contaminating it? And the third implication for Tonga is, and we said it about the ash bringing heavy metals and trace elements into the water, which can be toxic. Or what's the effect of the marine life? Like if the algal blooms are toxic and fish eat the algal blooms, then what's the harm to human health if people eat the fish? Or what happens to those toxins when they get into the plants for their crops? And they're questions we just don't know yet. But they certainly are something that we need to work through, really to help not just Tonga, but other communities that could be affected by similar sort of volcanoes. And don't forget, I should point out, this volcano is nothing special. It's exactly the same type of volcanoes we have in New Zealand. White Island is exactly the same as this. Urupei is exactly the same as this. So this risk is a global risk, and it's just as much a risk for New Zealand coastal communities as it is for Tongan coastal communities.
Great, thanks for that. Stuart, I think we'll just maybe take your question, and then yeah, we might call it a day on that, and then get into the branch meeting. So, Stuart.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, Kevin, fantastic presentation again. I know you've given it about 3 or 4 times, and it just different aspects keep coming out from it. So really great, and great to see the outcome from the USV survey. On one of your displays, there was a gain and loss. So obviously there was some data beforehand. What data was there? You know, and how fortuitous was it?
Yes, so that's a good question actually, because I know Lynn's sitting on that early data. So that's from when the volcano erupted in 2015, 2016, an American research vessel was operating nearby, and it happened to suffer not a serious mechanical problem, but a mechanical problem that forced them to go into port at Tongatapu for repairs. And on the way, they thought, just because this volcano is erupting, let's just opportunistically map it, just because we can. And that's the only reason why they did it, is because they happened to be going into Tongatapu for repairs. And if it wasn't for that previous map, you know, we couldn't make any sort of understanding about actually what happened on the seafloor, and come up with these magic numbers that we're looking at. And the implication of that is that if we then don't know how big this volcano is, it then restricts us in ability to really model and understand what happened that day, but more to the point, what the future risk is for other volcanoes. So it was purely opportunistic, and we're very lucky to have that 2016 survey by American research vessel. And I should point out too that all this data, Stuart, will be going to Lynn's for their chart production.
Nice to hear. Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, so thanks again, Kevin, for that. And yeah, I guess keep up the good work. It'll be interesting to see what unfolds over the next wee while as you, I guess, no doubt return and yeah, get into it a bit more going forward. I guess that brings us to our Wellington branch meeting. So I guess first of all, if there are any apologies, can you please just put them in the comments, just given time. We can then, yeah, just collaborate those. In terms of confirmation of last meeting minutes, I guess, has anyone reviewed those that were sent out? And can we please get confirmation that they are an accurate record of the discussion we had? Feel free to put your hand up remotely. Did you read them, Brett? No. Can you say you read them?
Okay, yeah, I will.
Yeah, I guess if you can read them and then confirm that later on,
Okay.
that might be the best way to do that.
Yep, go ahead.
And Ryan, if you can read them and confirm that they're an accurate record later, potentially, that might be the best way to do that. In terms of an update from me, we have been doing a bit of work in the background, obviously ahead of our AGM that's coming up later in the year. So I think we've seen a couple of notices on that. That has, yeah, so I guess if you can RSVP, that would be helpful. We've also followed up on the finance side of things in relation to payment from the national office. Genevieve's done a lot of work there with yeah, with Surveying Spatial National Office. As Colin, I think, McElwain picked up, there was a payment that was missed for one of the years, which, yeah, wasn't immediately resolvable, but we managed to get there in the end. So the branch has, yeah, managed to secure that extra payment that was missed from, I think, 2020. So thanks, Genevieve, for that. Other than that, I guess I don't really have anything specific to raise from the chairperson's report. There was nothing from the accounts. I don't think Glenn had anything, but in terms of our exec, Sarah, are you online?
Yep. No real update other than if you have any, or you're probably starting to have new grads start soon, just remember to flick through their emails through email addresses through to me, so that they can be kept in the loop regarding YP stuff that's going on. Yep, thank you.
Awesome, thanks, Sarah. Dave, anything from planning? Is Dave here? Yes.
Hi, I'm just going to give a quick summary. I did make some submissions on the recent MDRS plan change round. So Wellington City have released a whole new plan. So I made a submission on WCC's new plan. Lower Hutt, Upper Hutt and KCDC have put out plan changes, and I've made submissions on those. I got some help from Nick and his team at KCDC for the submission on plan change 2, I think it is. I wasn't able to get myself organised or get any help with Pororua, mainly because that coincided, the submission date was the same as the Wellington City plans date, so I prioritised Wellington City. Just a question that might be for people here today, or they can take back to their offices. Has any, I know Cutlass have made submissions on KCDC, but have any other survey firms in the region made submissions for their respective firms? If you could let me know, maybe get a copy of those, and then we can look to see what we can do with the further submission stage. And yeah, whether as a branch I can make submissions in sort of support of some of the other firms' submissions. That's probably about it. I think just a general comment, Wellington City on their new plan, possibly a little bit surprised they didn't get too many submissions. I'm not sure exactly what the numbers are, but rumour is they only had around 400 submissions, which is possibly incredibly low for a whole new district plan. Maybe that's an indication of people sort of thinking that things are a fait accompli under the NPS and the MDRS, or that people are just too busy with other things, and planning and the district plans just not a priority in life at the moment. That's all from me.
Thanks very much, Dave. And it's probably remiss of me not to have thanked you earlier just for the body of work that you did complete on behalf of the Institute. It was quite a significant effort there. So yeah, much appreciate the time and effort that you put into the submissions on behalf of the branch, I suppose, for all of us. So thanks very much for that. Andrew, is Andrew online? Spatial. No, I don't think he is. think that's probably it for the exec then. Were there any achievements or obituaries that anyone wanted to raise? Okay. I guess just in terms of achievements, something that we've talked about at the exec is ahead of the AGM, if there are any specific achievements or awards or qualifications that members have obtained, we're quite keen to recognise them at the AGM. So if you can send them through to, I guess, myself or Jen or the branch email, then that would be much appreciated, just so we can compile those and yeah, just recognise and celebrate those achievements at the AGM as part of that. Are there any other items of general business that anyone wanted to raise? Mike Morris has his hand up.
Yeah, no, just an update on processing at Lynn's. Unfortunately, the lodgement rate continues not to be extremely high, but steady. We're still coping well, and we're putting processes in place for 4 weeks, alternate weeks leading up to Christmas, where our staff will be doing additional hours. So we hope to maintain a good level of control over the routine type data sets that we do, so normal subdivisions. But the more complex work, which may include limited titles, unit titles, water boundaries and things like that, of which that is only about 20% of the work that we have coming in, that may continue to push out a bit the timing. Please bear with us. We're pulling as many levers as we can. We don't anticipate getting into the trouble that we did prior to last Christmas, though.
Thanks very much, Mike. Good to hear that that is yeah, something that you guys have taken into account. Andrew, I can see you're online. Did you have anything to update us on Spatial? Sorry, can't hear you.
Sorry, I can't. I'm not sure if this is working. I can't see anything. I haven't got anything to add, really. I don't know if you can hear me. I can't see anything, so I've got my screen is completely blank. The only thing on the spatial front is the APSI, sorry, the spatial award stuff is there's something coming up there. I should get that out so that people can know if they need to, if they want to go to that award ceremony, I think it is. And we're lining up GRIP for a presentation. So that'd be all for me.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, that GRIP presentation will likely be early next year. There's something to sort of kick things off. Obviously, with the AGM coming up, don't want to overload people with quality content. So yeah, that'll be early 2023. One other item of general business, I suppose, is to do with traffic management. The Institute, Surveying Spatial NZ sent out the Reformer and Practice Note to be implemented with the local RCAs. Just keen to hear from any members out there that have had experience in the Wellington region. We have applied, I think, for 3 or 4 of the RCAs for work out here. But yeah, just keen to hear back from anyone that has tried to go through that process, so that potentially we can, as a branch, coordinate that effort across the wider Wellington region. So yeah, keen to hear from you. If you're having any trouble or success, I suppose, as well. That's all I have. Does anyone else have anything they want to raise before we close the meeting? Beauty. Well, I guess that's probably slightly over time. Apologies for that. Thanks for hanging in there, and yeah, hopefully we'll see most of you in person at the AGM later in the year. Thanks very much. Sorry, also just before I go, that this meeting is recorded as well, so we can send a link out to those of you who are interested to revisit some of that or potentially pass it on to anyone else. So yeah, thanks very much for tuning in, and yeah, we'll be in touch later in the year.
Thanks, Nick. You.